Hey, tonight, we begin not with knights in shining armor or angelic choirs echoing from cathedral walls, but with something far messier, the uncomfortable truth behind centuries of blood spilled in the name of salvation. The Crusades weren't a spiritual journey. They were a military campaign, baptized in arrogance, launched with holy banners, and carried out by men who believed that stabbing the right person could earn them a front-row seat in paradise. Less about divine love, more about territorial control. Scripture-apt violence sold as righteousness to people who couldn't read Latin but liked the idea of being forgiven for murder, as long as it happened in Jerusalem. And if you're still awake, still listening, still looking for a place where your thoughts can slow down and the noise of the day fades into something older, something quieter, then grab a blanket. Maybe light a candle. Not for prayer, just for the vibe. And tell me in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is. There's something oddly comforting in knowing that across cities, countries, time zones, someone else is lying in bed, drifting through the wreckage of history, just like you. It all started, as these things usually do, with a man in a robe making dangerous promises to a crowd that probably should have asked a few follow-up questions. Claremont, 1095. Pope Urban II stands before a sea of nobles, peasants, and future corpses, preaching fire, forgiveness, and a one-way trip to the Holy Land. Not for sightseeing, but for sanctified bloodshed. Not their own, ideally. He spoke of liberation, of duty, of heaven flinging open its gates for anyone willing to pick up a sword for Christ. And just like that, Europe's angriest, poorest, and most gullible packed their bags, kissed their cows goodbye, and marched east with the enthusiasm of people who thought gods will came with dental care and pre-approved glory. Europe's angriest, poorest, and most gullible packed their bags, kissed their cows goodbye, and marched east, not with strategy, but with panic. A desperation so raw it whispered, maybe killing strangers could fix your life. They called it a holy war. Holiness, however, was in short supply. What they had was mud, lice, cheap religious symbols stitched by drunk tailors, and a level of groupthink so intense it made otherwise sane men believe their rusty blade was a divine key to heaven. No one really knew where Jerusalem was. Medieval geography was a vibe, not a science. But that didn't stop thousands, men, a few women, some kids, from stumbling out of Europe like a stampede of angry livestock in chainmail, chasing redemption with the same intensity some people chase food trucks. Before they could fight infidels, they had to get through Hungary. Spoiler, Hungary wasn't thrilled. One of the first mobs to set out, led by Peter the Hermit, a man who looked like a rejected monastery audition, managed to burn through their supplies within days and then started looting Christian towns just to stay alive. Yes, before they'd even glimpsed an enemy, they were already murdering their own neighbors. Off to a holy start. Peter's crew, quaintly titled the People's Crusade, though chaotic rampage would have been more accurate, marched under delusions of divine protection. Tens of thousands followed him, armed with pitchforks, desperation, and blind hope. They believed miracles would feed them, shield them, guide them. Instead, they got ambushed, starved, and wiped out by soldiers who didn't appreciate a peasant parade storming through their borders uninvited. Meanwhile, the official First Crusade, led by nobles who smelled slightly better and owned shinier swords, tried a more organized approach. Though, splitting into 4 armies with no central leadership is only organized if your definition of structure includes ego, rivalry, and a shared delusion that God was exclusively on your side. It wasn't a coalition. It was a cosplay convention of holy war, each group arguing over who got to loot what before they even arrived. When they finally reached Anatolia, they met the Seljuk Turks, who, shockingly, didn't surrender on cue. They fought back, hard, and, as it turns out, dragging thousands of men across hostile terrain, in sweltering heat, on foot, in armor, with minimal supplies, tends to break an army. Who could have guessed? The Crusaders began collapsing, not heroically, but slowly, like armored beetles on their backs, loud, disoriented, and very bad at hills. But none of that really mattered, because the myth was stronger than the meat. Every hardship, every corpse, every collapse was reframed as a divine trial. God, they believed, was sharpening them, with dysentery, frostbite, and the kind of misery that came with chewing your own sandals. If you died, congratulations, straight to heaven. If you survived, great, back in line to keep killing. Morale was either miraculous or delusional, depending on the lighting. Cities fell, not with valor, but with shrieks, fire, and the kind of chaos history books prefer to skip. Ansh? A siege written in starvation and betrayal. Crusaders digging through corpses for dinner. Some sources, medieval and disturbingly enthusiastic, even mention cannibalism. But at some point, propaganda and survival start sounding the same. Then came Jerusalem, the crown jewel. The prize hallucinated into sainthood after years of muddy water and frost-bitten toes. By the time they arrived in 1099, they were half dead and fully convinced they were chosen. When they breached the walls, they made sure God noticed. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a purge. Men, women, children, Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christians. The streets ran red, and the Crusaders walked ankle-deep in their own warped definition of devotion. Eyewitnesses, including the Crusaders themselves, described the massacre with an almost cheerful reverence, like holiness could be measured by the gallon. The more you bled others, the brighter your halo. Jerusalem wasn't liberated. It was incinerated, saved, in the same way a wildfire saves a forest. And yet, Europe celebrated. The Pope called it a holy triumph. Bells rang, hymns rose, artists sketched halos on killers. And in that moment, the myth calcified, that faith could justify anything, that slaughter could be sacred, that somewhere in the noise, God had smiled. But the truth, as it tends to be, was quieter. The survivors weren't saints. They were blood-soaked, hollow-eyed, spiritually fractured. They wandered through the ruins looking for relics and redemption, and found mostly rot. Yes, they'd won. But no one could explain what, exactly, they had become. And you, in your quiet room, under warm blankets, buffered by centuries of hindsight, might wonder, would I have marched? Would I have followed the sermon? Would I have ignored the screams and chased the promise? Maybe, or maybe not. But one thing's for sure, you wouldn't have lasted 24 hours. Because if you thought the holy part was bad, just wait until you hear about the logistics. The sermons promised glory. They forgot to mention the mileage, thousands of kilometers across enemy terrain, in armor that turned your torso into a medieval Dutch oven, and boots that doubled as open wounds. This wasn't a journey. It was a heat stroke in slow motion, a spiritual spiral wearing rusty steel. Weather, a cosmic joke. Summers melted your resolve. Winters froze your bones. Faith turned brittle. Teeth cracked. And somehow, they still pressed on, convinced that divine love smelled like sweat and gangrene. Animals went first, horses, dogs, mules. Then came alternatives. Some accounts describe crusaders roasting fallen comrades. Later historians tried to clean it up. They only ate pagans. They said, like cannibalism with theological footnotes made it gourmet. Apparently, barbecue becomes holy when paired with scripture. By the time they reached enemy territory, they were barely human. Starving, sunburnt, hollow-eyed, and more vision than flesh. But they still believed they were winning. Every rotting companion became a martyr. Every infected wound, a divine reminder. Every step, a sacrifice God was presumably tallying up like reward points. And speaking of divine arithmetic, let's talk about who they killed along the way. Because the path to Jerusalem wasn't linear. It was messy, crooked, cruel. In cities like Mines and Worms, Crusaders massacred Jewish communities. Men, women, children, torching synagogues in the name of cleansing Christendom. They hadn't even reached Muslim lands yet. But the sword was restless. And hatred, as always, was an easy thing to sharpen. Other groups fought each other. Western Europeans didn't get along. Shocking, I know. The French hated the Germans. The Germans hated the Italians. The Italians hated everyone. And no one could agree on leadership. The only thing they shared was the fantasy that the Holy Land was theirs by divine right, and that anyone in the way, including fellow Christians, was a justifiable casualty. When they sacked Byzantine towns and looted churches that were supposed to be allies, it wasn't a misstep. It was a warm-up. Then came the locals, not warriors, just people. Farmers, traders, children. Entire cities were cleansed at sword point while crusaders sang hymns beside burning homes. They called it liberation. The locals called it what it was, murder. But history, ever susceptible to good branding, preferred the version that came with choirs. And no, the violence wasn't strategic. It was emotional. These weren't disciplined soldiers following a plan. They were angry, confused, often illiterate men with too much adrenaline and not enough perspective. They weren't obeying orders. They were obeying rage. Religion simply gave them permission to unleash what they already wanted. Destruction, domination, and the delicious feeling of being righteous while setting someone else's life on fire. And hygiene? Non-existent. Bathing was seen as dangerous. Water, after all, could open your pores and let demons sneak in. So they marched for weeks caked in grime, their tunics stiff with dried sweat, blood, and whatever sins stuck. Wounds went untreated. Infections spread like rumors. Lice rode along like freeloaders on a pilgrimage. By the time they reached the Holy Land, they looked like corpses who hadn't gotten the memo. At night, the camps were a fever dream of suffering. No silence, no structure, just coughing, groaning, vomiting, praying, and the occasional stabbing, because arguments over stale bread escalated fast. There were no real tents, just makeshift shelters stitched from stolen fabric and broken optimism. Everyone slept with one eye open and one hand on something sharp. Trust was a luxury no one could afford, especially in a war blessed by God but organized by chaos. And yet, come morning, they prayed. Knees in the mud, faces blank, lips mumbling Latin they barely understood. They begged for strength, for victory, for forgiveness, as if the screams from the night before hadn't already made it to heaven. As if a ritual could overwrite what their hands had done. The irony was thick enough to spread on whatever bread hadn't been stolen or fought over. These were men who believed they were saving the world by slicing it open, who wore crosses on their backs while breaking every commandment they supposedly defended. Soldiers of light, leaving every village just a little darker than before. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the truth was filtered like wine through stained glass. Survivors sent letters home filled with heroic embellishments. Poets turned massacres into hymns. The church printed indulgences and, metaphorically speaking, postcards. Europe applauded from afar, blissfully disconnected from the rot it had sponsored. And the enemies, the so-called infidels? Many, especially Muslim leaders like Saladin, showed far more restraint than the Crusaders. They negotiated. They spared civilians. They treated prisoners with dignity, which makes it harder to cling to the idea that the Crusades were ever about virtue. Because if your enemy behaves better than you, maybe you're not the hero after all. But this wasn't a story looking for heroes. It was a system, a loop, a machine that devoured generation after generation. Every new crusade followed the same broken blueprint. Rally the faithful, march into misery, besiege something, slaughter it, repeat. And when it didn't work, they blamed the sinners and tried again. Because it's never the system's fault. It's yours, mine, the pagans, the weather, or someone's wandering lust. That's what makes it terrifying. The Crusades weren't an isolated mistake. They were an idea, seductive, polished, dripping with scripture, rotting beneath the gold. An idea that killing could be holy, that horror could wear a halo, that redemption could be soaked in blood. And the worst part? It worked. For centuries. You've heard the sanitized version. Gallant knights, noble duels, banners flapping in slow motion. But that's not what this was. This wasn't a war movie. It was a butcher shop with branding. No one came out clean, not physically, not morally, not even metaphorically. If you're imagining elegant formations and choreographed cavalry charges, stop. This was desperation swinging rusted metal into screaming chaos. Most of the time, no one even knew who was winning until one side ran out of limbs. And if you were injured, good luck. No medics, no aid, no gentle hands. If you lost an arm, you bled out. A shattered leg? You crawled until someone crushed your skull out of mercy. Wounds got packed with mud if you were lucky, or ignored entirely. Because in the Crusades, stopping to help meant becoming the next body in the mud. Most fighters weren't trained. They were peasants with pitchforks, city boys borrowing swords from dead uncles, and teenage zealots convinced that stabbing a stranger scored points with God. Discipline was a myth. Strategy was a rumor. Battle plans boiled down to run at them and scream. And somehow, against all odds, people still expected glory. What they got was gangrene. And then came the sieges, not the fast-paced, cinematic ones, but the long, miserable ones. Weeks, months, just sitting outside a city, starving in tents, while your enemies stayed dry behind stone walls and occasionally threw insults or arrows. Morale didn't crash. It decayed. Quietly. Like the rat that crawled into your boot 3 days ago and never came out. If the walls fell, and that was a big if, it wasn't triumph. It was explosion. All the rage, all the fear, all the rotting boredom finally let loose. That's when the real killing began. Not soldier against soldier. Crusader against anyone still breathing. Civilians. Women. Children. Entire neighborhoods swept off the map, not by tactics, but by exhaustion and sanctified madness. They called it justice. They walked through blood-slick alleys, muttering prayers, their blades dripping, their eyes blank from fatigue and a fervor so deep it made murder feel divine. This wasn't war. It was therapy for people who had been promised salvation and found only violence. And the reward for their victory? A city they couldn't hold. The Crusaders didn't know the languages, didn't understand the land, built fortresses in deserts and wondered why supply lines collapsed. They issued laws no one respected, worshipped in churches no one entered, and demanded taxes from people who had nothing left to give. Insurrections came. Retaliations followed. Cities changed hands like cursed heirlooms. A castle gained today would be torched tomorrow. And every defeat? Blamed on sin. They hadn't prayed hard enough. Someone let in heresy. Someone touched themselves. The solution? Repent harder. Bleed more. Blame someone else. It became a loop. Not just military. Spiritual. Attack. Suffer. Pray. Attack again. Every loss was rebranded as divine preparation. Every corpse, a test. God, they said, was sharpening them, like knives made from bone and denial. until all that remained was faith dried up like the last puddle outside a broken wall. And the knights, the ones who were supposed to know what they were doing? Not much better. They came for glory, gold, and martyrdom fit for stained glass. Some took vows of poverty, then looted monasteries. Others swore chastity, then raided brothels. And when they got bored of killing infidels, they turned on each other. Rival factions, rival saints, rival hairstyles. The Holy Land became a runway of egos wrapped in chainmail, all convinced they were God's favorite war criminal. If you think there was honor, there wasn't. Knights trampled peasants. Commanders sacrificed their own men for half-baked tactical stunts. Leaders betrayed each other mid-siege just to grab a slightly bigger slice of some city they couldn't spell. Morality was a suggestion. Loyalty expired as soon as a shinier sword appeared on the table. And all the while, actual residents, Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christians, watched their homes get torn apart by Europeans with heatstroke and superiority complexes. Farmers planted crops that got crushed under holy hooves. Families buried their dead, then buried more the next season. New flag, same violence. And still, more kept coming. Wave after wave of crusaders, generation after generation. The first barely made it. The second collapsed faster. The third forgot the point halfway through. But the church kept calling. And Europe kept answering. Like a cursed travel brochure, come for the salvation. Stay for the dysentery. Those who returned, the rare few, came back changed. Not holy, not heroic, just hollow. Some became monks. Some became drunks. Most didn't speak about what they saw. Because how do you describe the inside of a siege tower packed with corpses? How do you explain the sound of a city dying under your feet? How do you tell your family you didn't bring relics, just trauma? So next time someone calls the Crusades glorious, remind them, real glory doesn't rot your feet, reek of scorched livestock, or require mopping up after mass murder. The truth is simple. If you had been there, you wouldn't have made it. Not through the swords. Not through the sickness. Not through the silence after the screaming stopped. You would have stood there, surrounded by blood, dust, broken icons, and asked the only honest question left. How could this possibly be divine? And then, they saw it. Rising from the haze like a promise no one could afford to keep. Jerusalem. The holy city. The goal. The prize. The bloody carrot at the end of a 1,000-mile death march. They stood there, filthy, fevered, infected, and delirious, staring at its ancient walls as if salvation would pour through the stones and absolve them of everything they'd done to get there. It didn't. Jerusalem didn't shine. It loomed. Massive stone walls that had weathered centuries of war. Defenders who weren't moved by slogans or impressed by crusaders wrapped in rotting chainmail. Inside were civilians, soldiers, priests, merchants, all bracing for the storm of zealotry gathering outside their gates. And outside, tens of thousands who had walked across continents, dragging their guilt, their fever, and their prophecy to this moment. There was no turning back. There wasn't even a plan. Just prayer, exhaustion, and the kind of madness that blooms when you confuse destiny with permission. They laid siege, not with strategy, but with sheer stubbornness. Weeks passed. Food vanished. Water turned to sludge. They gnawed on belts. Horses dropped. Arguments broke out. Some turned on each other, but no one left. When the walls finally gave way, it wasn't a triumph, it was frenzy. The Crusaders surged in like a dam breaking, eyes wild, blades already red in anticipation. There were no orders, no mercy, no time to distinguish between enemies and the merely unfortunate. The slaughter wasn't tactical, it was theatrical. Heads rolled. Children were trampled. Temples bled. And through it all, the hymns kept rising, louder than the screams. They killed indiscriminately. Muslims, Jews, Christians who didn't look sufficiently Western, priests at their altars, women in cellars, the sick in hospital beds. The killing didn't stop until the streets ran like rivers, and the sacred walls, once white with prayer, turned black with history. Chroniclers, Christian ones, wrote that crusaders waded through blood up to their knees, up to the bridles of their horses. And they weren't ashamed. They were proud. Because to them, it wasn't murder. It was purification, a divine purge, a baptism in the blood of the unworthy. It wasn't called genocide, it was called justice. And Jerusalem, carved by centuries of faith and fire, stood quietly beneath the carnage, holy, yes, but hollow now, stripped of people, stuffed with corpses and delusion. And then they prayed. Of course they did. They fell to their knees on the very stones they just soaked in blood, thanked God for the miracle, and began dividing up their new kingdom like they hadn't just committed mass murder with biblical enthusiasm. They crowned themselves rulers of a city that no longer had a population, only ghosts. And Europe? Europe clapped. News, sanitized, polished, convenient, traveled quickly. Songs were sung. Bishops cried tears of joy. Artists painted halos on killers. The Pope smiled. The massacre was marketed as salvation, a holy triumph. Never mind the orphans. Never mind the smoke curling from burned temples. Never mind the silence. This is how mythology is born. Not through truth, but through distance. The farther you are from the screaming, the easier it is to believe the story, especially when it's bound in leather, kissed by clergy, and stamped with righteousness. They turned Jerusalem into a trophy, a relic, a brand, the beginning of a myth that would justify every crusade that came after. But on the ground, those who survived, who hid, who escaped, who simply endured, saw no glory. They saw monsters in mail. They buried their dead in silence, left when they could. And those who stayed lived under rulers who spoke another language, prayed to the same God in a foreign tone, and walked streets still sticky from their arrival. And yet, incredibly, the Crusaders believed they had brought peace. Not the kind that follows diplomacy, but the kind that follows extinction. They planted crosses on towers, installed puppet kings, renamed quarters of the city like children playing empire. They held mass in churches scrubbed of blood, mostly, and they slept, finally, in beds that didn't move, surrounded by walls they hadn't built, in homes whose owners they had buried. But peace built on bones doesn't last. Retaliations brewed, alliances cracked, resistance simmered beneath the rubble. While crusaders feasted on stolen bread and mapped their next expansion, the rest of the world waited, not to forgive, but to reclaim. Because Jerusalem is more than a city. It's a wound, a symbol, a mirror. It reflects whatever you carry into it. Hope, prophecy, vengeance, ego. And in 1099, it reflected something terrifying. The moment salvation dressed itself like a massacre, and no one in power flinched. And you, dear listener, wrapped in a blanket, thousands of years and miles away, maybe you're wondering how you would have acted. Would you have marched? Hidden? Run? But by the time those gates opened, that question didn't matter anymore. It wasn't about who was right. It was about who was still alive. They called it the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but it was never really a kingdom. It was a patchwork of arrogance stitched together by men who thought ruling meant building castles and waiting for uprisings. After the slaughter, they needed something to do besides looting and praying. So they drew maps, invented borders, crowned themselves kings of sand. A holy empire on unstable ground, wrapped in gold and Latin no one local could read. They imported nobility from Europe, lords who had never seen sand, who didn't speak Arabic, Greek, or anything that wasn't shouted from horseback. Men who believed they'd inherited not just land, but a divine right to rule over people they saw as background extras in their personal epic. Governance was crude. Justice, inconsistent. Taxes were crushing. Loyalty, a punchline. Yes, there were fortresses, majestic piles of stone stacked on hills like overconfident tombstones. But even the most awe-inspiring castle is just a bigger target when you have no allies and fewer friends. The Crusader states were surrounded, militarily, politically, spiritually. Every transaction could be a trap. Every silence, a prelude to siege. Inside the cities, tension simmered. The ruling class built their European fantasy on looted land, sipping imported wine and pretending the desert was optional. Meanwhile, the locals adapted, again. They bartered in shadows, whispered in corners, and passed down stories that didn't match the official narrative. Resistance didn't shout. It waited. Paranoia flourished. Crusader lords suspected everyone. Spies were everywhere, or nowhere. Priests blamed droughts on heresy. Executions became routine. Streets that once carried incense now reeked of fear. And beneath it all, the quiet dread of being forgotten by the Europe that had sent them. Reinforcements rarely came. Supplies dwindled. Hope turned to rumor. The church responded by sending bishops to manage the holiness. They built cathedrals, echoing monuments too large to defend and too holy to ignore. When walls were breached, they doubled as panic rooms. Inside, relics were guarded like gold, and gold was hoarded like relics. Piety had a price. And salvation? Well, it came with a receipt. Crusader politics were a carnival of crowns and cowardice. Everyone wanted to rule. No one wanted the responsibility. Kings vanished. Nobles defected. Alliances crumbled like old parchment. What held it all together wasn't belief. It was momentum. They had come too far, killed too much, and now they couldn't imagine leaving. But the locals never forgot. To them, the Crusaders weren't rulers. They were squatters in armor. The marketplace remembered the first fire. The mosques remembered the blood. Children grew up beneath flags they never chose, learning names they didn't respect. Rebellion wasn't a question. It was a countdown. And when it came, it didn't come from where the Crusaders were looking. It came from a man named Yusuf ibn Ayyub, though history remembers him as Saladin. Strategic, patient, fluent in both diplomacy and destruction. While the Crusaders bickered over relics and chapels, Saladin was uniting emirs. Where they schemed, he negotiated. Where they flailed, he focused. His war wasn't holy. It was precise. And that made it terrifying. Meanwhile, the Crusader states began to rot from the inside. Corruption took root. Bribes became policy. Church officials lived like kings. Merchants sold weapons to the enemy if the price was right. The holiness they claimed to defend had quietly converted into a business plan. Pilgrims were taxed. Foreigners extorted. And God? God was a trademark. But decay rarely arrives with fanfare. It creeps. Day by day. The walls still stood. The bells still rang. Processions marched through streets scrubbed clean of memory. The illusion held, barely, but the cracks were there. In the shortened prayers. In the rusted armor. In the glances exchanged when no one dared say the obvious. This won't last. And they were right. The Crusader states, for all their pageantry, were never built to endure. They were outposts of ego, held up by myth, and run by men who mistook stubbornness for skill. They couldn't feed themselves, couldn't unite, couldn't adapt. But worst of all, they refused to leave. So they stayed. And they fell. One siege at a time. One betrayal after another. Until the so-called eternal kingdom of Jerusalem was reduced to a handful of desperate fortresses and muttered prayers. The people who remained didn't write history. They endured it. And the dream of a holy empire? It turned to dust, denial, and silence. But the Crusaders left something behind, not salvation, not peace, ruins, echoes, a lesson chiseled into stone and soaked into the ground. You can't build paradise on bones and expect angels to show up. And you, still awake, still wandering this broken landscape with me. Maybe now you see it too. The way power wraps itself in scripture. The way belief becomes armor. The way history forgets everything except the anthem. Welcome to the Crusader states, where God was king, but incompetence wrote the laws. It didn't begin with thunder. It began with strategy. While Crusader lords stumbled like drunk relic collectors, Saladin watched, waited, quietly rearranged the board. He didn't shout. He didn't pose. He didn't need to. He was the kind of man who sharpened his sword in silence and smiled while others underestimated him. And the Crusaders? They underestimated everything. Saladin didn't rise on visions or theatrics. He rose on intelligence, diplomacy, patience, and the unwavering certainty that Jerusalem didn't belong to people who treated it like a souvenir. He united fragmented Muslim territories, not through fire, but through trust. Not by demanding loyalty, but by embodying it. While the Crusaders taxed pilgrims and prayed for reinforcements that never came, Saladin built an empire on cohesion. He didn't scream about God. He didn't wave martyrdom around like a flag. He moved, deliberately, like a surgeon restoring a body that had been mutilated. One fortress at a time, one emir at a time. And the Crusaders watched, like tourists watching a storm gather on the horizon, sure their holy umbrellas would hold. They didn't. The storm came in waves, calculated, relentless, personal. Saladin wasn't just reclaiming territory. He was correcting a humiliation. And unlike the Crusaders, who fought for indulgences and artifacts, Saladin fought for the living. His army wasn't drunk on piety. It was focused, furious, and, most dangerous of all, united. And then came Hattin. If the Crusades had a breaking point, this was it. July 4th, 1187. Poetic, really. Independence from illusion. The Crusader army, lured away from water, boiled under the sun. Their holy relics flapped uselessly in the wind like divine laundry. By the end, most were dead, captured, or begging for mercy. Their invincible kingdom, reduced to smoldering armor and collective regret. Saladin didn't slaughter them all, and that's what hurt. He was merciful, on purpose. He freed prisoners, spared cities that surrendered, treated enemies with a humanity the Crusaders had forgotten somewhere outside the gates of Jerusalem. His message was clear. This is how you act when you believe in something greater than your own ego. And then, Jerusalem. But not like before. No flames. No rivers of blood. No hymns rising over screams. Saladin walked in, took it back, and prayed. Just prayed. He didn't bathe the city in vengeance. He let Christians leave. He let Jews return. He reminded the world you can be powerful without being cruel. Europe was shocked, almost offended. How dare their holy city be retaken quietly? The Pope called for another crusade. Kings wept. Knights scrambled. The same men who had saved Jerusalem now rushed to save it again. But the mystique was broken. The illusion of divine dominance was gone. And with it, the first kingdom of Jerusalem. The Third Crusade came, led by Richard the Lionheart and his dramatic sense of destiny. He fought well. negotiated better. But in the end, he shook Saladin's hand and went home with stories of valor and not much else. Jerusalem stayed Muslim. Richard? He died of an infected shoulder. Symbolic, really. Back in the Crusader states, or what was left of them, the mood soured. The war wasn't holy anymore. It was exhausting, expensive, cynical. Peasants stopped pretending. Lords started selling land they hadn't even conquered. Pilgrims arrived not for salvation, but for souvenirs. The dream of cleansing the East had faded into a dusty, prolonged layover. Saladin, meanwhile, didn't become a god or a tyrant. He remained human, flawed, tired, mortal. He died in 1193. Left no treasure, no golden throne, just a reputation. A man who reclaimed a city and kept his soul. His enemies respected him. His people wept. The Crusaders? They wrote his name down, carefully. But his death didn't reverse what he built. It only slowed it. The momentum had shifted. The East had risen. The West was stalling. And as crusade followed crusade, the fourth, the fifth, is this still going? They became parodies of themselves. Ships crashed. Leaders bickered. Some crusaders even sacked Christian cities, just to stay in shape. And through it all, Jerusalem remained, scarred, sacred, watched. Not just a dot on a map, but a mirror. Of ambition, of belief, of failure. Saladin's legacy wasn't a monument. It was memory. A memory that outlived castles, kings, and every papal bull money could buy. You're sitting there now, maybe wrapped in a blanket, maybe scrolling through your phone, and it's hard to picture all this. But it happened. These weren't gods. They were people. Terrified, devout, deluded, brilliant. And they built a war that still echoes in politics, myths, and headlines. So remember this. The Crusades weren't just about land. They were about identity, the stories we invent to excuse the worst parts of ourselves. And sometimes, the one who wins is the one who stops shouting and listens. That's what Saladin did. He listened to his people, to the past, to something quieter than vengeance, something deeper. And while the Crusaders polished their crosses and confessed their sins, he simply opened the gates and let the city breathe again. It's one thing to lose a war. It's another to keep fighting it long after everyone forgot why it started. Welcome to the later Crusades, where the goals blurred, the heroes burned out, and the holy cause started to smell like desperation and poor accounting. The swords stayed sharp. The prayers stayed loud. But the purpose? That went missing somewhere between Venice and a balance sheet. The Fourth Crusade was meant to reclaim Jerusalem. What it reclaimed instead was debt. Crusaders couldn't afford ships. So they made a deal with Venice. Because when you're broke, who better to trust than medieval merchants in feathered hats? The Venetians agreed to help, if the Crusaders first attacked a Christian city to settle the bill. You know, just a small detour on the way to salvation. Jesus would understand. That city was Zara, Catholic, Christian, under papal protection. The Crusaders sacked it anyway. The Pope excommunicated them all, briefly, then remembered he needed their swords. Forgiveness was expedited, and with their sin hastily forgiven, the Crusaders sailed on. Not to Jerusalem, but to Constantinople. Because of course they did. And there, in 1204, the mask finally slipped. Constantinople, the crown jewel of Eastern Christianity, wasn't conquered, it was cannibalized. By fellow Christians. Crusaders rampaged through streets once paved with theology and diplomacy, now stained with betrayal. They looted relics, torched icons, raped nuns, and melted down centuries of sacred art for pocket change. It was less of a crusade and more of a blackout drunk in full armor. And when the smoke cleared, they declared victory, not over infidels, but over themselves. The body of Christ devouring its own limbs. This was no longer about Jerusalem. It wasn't about the cross. It was about spoils. About power auctions wrapped in incense. The Byzantines never recovered. The East-West schism, already aching, split wide open. And the Muslims? They stood back, watched Christians burn each other alive, and took notes on how not to wage a holy war. By the time the Fifth Crusade arrived, it had mutated into farce. They tried Egypt. Yes, Egypt. Without maps. Without understanding the Nile floods. Without a plan beyond God will handle it. Spoiler, he didn't. The river rose, their camps drowned, and their troops floated downstream alongside their dignity. The enemy, notably, did not. And then came the Children's Crusade. Yes, really. Around 1212, thousands of children, some barely able to hold a staff, were convinced their innocence would succeed where armor had failed. They were told their purity could convert entire civilizations. Instead, many were sold, starved, stolen. It wasn't a crusade. It was a mass kidnapping with better branding. The Sixth Crusade turned diplomatic. Enter Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, heretic, genius, polyglot, and medieval troll. He negotiated the peaceful return of Jerusalem. No blood, no siege, just paperwork. The church hated him for it. He was excommunicated, again, because apparently, in this world, peace without gore was unholy. Success without slaughter was suspicious. By the Seventh and Eighth Crusades, the whole endeavor was a farce wearing rust. Funding evaporated. Enthusiasm curdled. Recruitment slowed to a crawl. Crusading had become the equivalent of a midlife crisis, an expensive distraction for nobles past their prime. The prayers still rang. The swords still gleamed. But the purpose? It had wandered off somewhere between Tunisia and absurdity. Louis IX of France led the final expeditions with the determination of a man too devout to read the room. He died of dysentery in North Africa, surrounded by sand, confusion, and the echoes of a calling that no longer called. Not a blaze of glory, just a slow, sweaty expiration, fitting for the era's last true believer. And Jerusalem? It changed hands again and again, like a relic too heavy to carry but too sacred to abandon. It never belonged to the Crusaders the way they imagined, as a crown, as a climax, as a cosmic endorsement. What they brought back wasn't victory. It was fatigue. What they carried home wasn't relics. It was rot, in the soul, in the treasury, in the myth. Europe limped home, not with honor, but with trauma. Nobles bankrupt, soldiers broken, faith shaken. They whispered doubts they dared not preach. Was it worth it? Was God even watching? Was the silence in the sanctuary a blessing or a verdict? And yet, it never officially ended. Crusading became less a movement and more a reflex, a background hum in European politics. If not against Muslims, then against heretics, or pagans, or peasants with the wrong beliefs. The targets changed. The weapon, sanctified violence, remained the same. Because once you learn to wrap ambition in scripture, it's hard to unlearn. But by now, maybe you feel it too. That creeping realization that the Crusades were never just a sequence of wars. They were a system, a mindset, a mirror, a convenient excuse to convert piety into power, to sanctify conquest, to export guilt and return with gold. And once that door was opened, it was never fully shut again. Centuries later, we're still whispering crusade in political speeches, boardrooms, military briefings. still polishing the same old lie, that righteousness rides on horseback, that blood can be holy, that God picks sides like a general. But tonight, maybe, just maybe, the illusion flickers. You see the cracks beneath the hymns, the currency behind the candles, the centuries of silence, smoke, and screaming, hiding beneath a banner of light. And that might be the first sacred thing to come out of all this. Legacies are strange. They don't obey intentions. They aren't neat. They sprawl. The Crusades didn't leave behind a holy empire. They left behind confusion, contradiction, a 1,000-year migraine disguised as moral clarity. What began as holy war now lingers as trauma, in archives, in ruins, in the quiet shame of collective memory. Start with Europe, the supposed victors. They came home empty, empty purses, empty eyes, widows waiting at docks, orphans looking up at monuments built by ghosts. The church grew fatter, nobles got smaller. The peasants, they kept digging, planting, starving, but now with sermons added to their suffering. The Crusades handed the church a new playbook, one that bled into land disputes, political marriages, tax codes. Indulgences became receipts for sin. Piety became public relations. You could now sin with foresight, just pay in advance. God, apparently, had a filing system. Universities bloomed, not as sanctuaries of enlightenment, but as administrative necessities. Someone had to read the bulls, interpret the contradictions, justify the slaughter. Latin became both key and gate. Knowledge was filtered, blessed, and chained to doctrine. And the knights? Some clung to the dream by forming orders, Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic, holy militias wrapped in oaths, swords, and accounting ledgers. They built castles, guarded roads, collected tithes, and ran banks so vast they scared the kings they once served. Until, of course, those kings realized fear was inconvenient and slaughtered them. Loyalty, as always, had an expiration date, especially when it earned compound interest. Art changed, music changed, but not in celebration, in mourning. Ballads bled, tapestries grew darker. Even love poetry bowed to doctrine, twisting desire into psalm. Every kiss apologized to the Pope. Every metaphor had to pass theological inspection. Chivalry, once imagined as noble, devolved into a marketing campaign, branding iron over banner. And the Jews? They paid, first, often, and most brutally. Crusades gave local mobs permission to slaughter without crossing a border. Synagogues torched. Families erased. Pogroms became pre-game rituals before the armies even left home. Why wait to kill infidels abroad? They said, when we have so many right here. Europe learned to hate systematically, bureaucratically, and it liked the efficiency. As for the Islamic world, it remembered. It still does. The Crusades weren't shelved in archives. They were etched into memory, into calligraphy, into the architecture of resistance. Jerusalem was never just a city. It became a scar that sang. Saladin wasn't just a sultan. He became a parable, a symbol that whispered through empires. Dignity is possible, even in fire. Trade stumbled, and then, strangely, bloomed. Cultural collisions happened, unplanned, unwanted, sometimes sublime. Arabic medicine crossed borders in saddlebags. Philosophy traveled between sieges. Mathematics smuggled itself into cathedrals. And somewhere along the trail of blood, someone cracked open a foreign book and saw the stars differently. But don't romanticize it. The bridges weren't built, they were breached. And everything that crossed over did so in chains of suspicion. Arabic science? Sorcery. Eastern astronomy? Heresy. Foreign knowledge arrived like contraband, fascinating, feared, forbidden, useful, but only if renamed. And then came the word. That venomous, durable word, infidel. It leaked into law, into language, into the marrow of empire. A license to dehumanize, to erase. A single word that outlived every crusader, echoing in colonial manifestos, inquisitorial decrees, drone justifications. Once you name someone unworthy of God, there's nothing you can't do to them, and still sleep at night. That's why, even now, you hear crusade in campaign speeches, in oil wars, in boardrooms, on t-shirts sold by men who mistake holy rage for purpose. It sounds noble, poetic, ancient, but peel it back and you find the same old rot. Fear wearing righteousness like armor. Violence washed in liturgy. Maps redrawn with Bibles instead of borders. And it's not just the West. Elsewhere, crusader became a slur. A shorthand for hypocrisy with boots. For centuries of arrogance marched over sacred soil. When extremists rise today, they don't invent grievances, they resurrect them. They show videos of bombs and relics and fire, and then whisper names like Saladin. The past becomes their fuel. And every corpse? Just a verse in an older song. Even architecture mourns in silence. Neo-Gothic cathedrals with towers like spears. Saints in stained glass, not blessing, but brandishing. Even the word knight still glows with perfume and polish, as if those metal-clad mercenaries were heroes and not tax-exempt warlords with better PR. Media plays along. Movies, games, novels. They edit history like it's a franchise. They give you swords, drama, thunder, but leave out the dysentery, the heat stroke, the theological footnotes that made slaughter seem like sainthood. What survives is the soundtrack. What's silenced is the smell. Modern wars still flirt with sacred language. Mission, deliverance, liberation, as if bullets carry moral weight, as if heaven issues visas, as if righteousness is a uniform and not a question. Crusading logic, rebranded for 21st century audiences. Even education whispers a sanitized script. Western students get the overview. Maybe a unit, maybe a paragraph. Rarely do they read Muslim, Jewish, or Eastern Christian voices. Rarely do they hear the story told by the burned, the buried, the banned. History isn't just written by the victors. It's edited by their publishers. There are still people today, real, loud, armed, who think we need another crusade. They chant it like prophecy, wear it like armor, quote 1095 like it's a commandment. They march with flags, not prayers. They hold scripture like a sword, and they say their mission is ancient, as if God left a voicemail in the Middle Ages and they're just now getting back to him. But you, still here, still listening, still drifting somewhere between sleep and thought. Maybe you hear something else now. Maybe you hear the silence between the hymns. Maybe you see the torchlight flickering behind the stained glass. Maybe you feel the weight of a history too heavy to carry and too dangerous to forget. They traded swords for sound bites, altars for algorithms. And the most sacred thing you can do now? Remember. Meanwhile, others try to reclaim the story. To honor the dead, not the killers. To build peace, not just prettier battlefields. But it's hard to rewrite a myth when the original came with a soundtrack and a sword. Tourism thrives on crusader nostalgia. You can walk through old forts in Acre, buy a plastic sword in Jerusalem, even book a crusader experience, as if pretending to besiege a city is wholesome family fun. History, commodified, suffering, gift-wrapped. And yet, something lingers. A discomfort. A question. Not were the Crusades wrong. That's too easy. But how close are we, really, to repeating them? New costumes. Same script. Because as long as belief is used not to shield, but to project, the ghosts of the Crusades will keep marching. Not through deserts, but through data. Through headlines. Through quiet justifications whispered in boardrooms and ballot boxes. And here you are again. Awake. Listening. Not as a historian, but as a witness. Because this isn't just about the past. It's about the mirror it holds up to now. And if you're brave enough to really look, you'll see more than knights and popes. You'll see flags, algorithms, platforms shaped like pulpits. You'll see how close salvation and supremacy have always stood, shoulder to shoulder, waiting for someone to blink first. You made it. Through fire, hymns, blood, and banners. Through holy lies dressed as destiny. Through silence mistaken for peace. And now, you're here. At the end. Or maybe just the edge of it. Because history doesn't end. It loops. It festers. It resurfaces. Especially the parts we pretend to forget. The Crusades aren't buried. They're not even sleeping. Just resting, like old embers. Waiting for the next fool with a match and a messiah complex. We built cathedrals to glorify them, museums to explain them, but also systems to repeat them. Borders, Bibles, bullet points, glossed over textbooks that skip the starvation, the rape, the 9-year-olds with wooden swords and rosaries. You were told they fought for faith, but it was always power, land, absolution, prepaid and tax-deductible. Not about saving souls, but counting them. Like inventory, like property, like dots on a scroll nobody reads anymore. And God? Well, he stayed mostly silent. Or maybe he left after the third massacre. If the Crusades proved anything, it's that invoking the divine doesn't mean he RSVP'd. We like to think we're better now. Kinder. Smarter, more evolved, but scroll the headlines. Squint. You'll see the script. New actors. Same lines. New tech. Same hymns. Because we still crave certainty. Still fear the other. Still sanctify our wars and demonize theirs. We dress prejudice in stained glass. Quote scripture like it's a combat manual. But the truth? It's quieter. It doesn't march. It waits. Under the rubble. In the margins. Behind the statues no one bothers to clean anymore. And you. Still lying there. In the dark. You're not alone. The past is loud. It hums through cracked ceilings. Flickers across tired screens. It reminds us that we come from people. Who sang hymns while burning libraries. Who nailed their fear to crosses, and called it salvation. But knowing this, that's power. Not the kind that conquers, the kind that refuses. So maybe that's the real crusade now. Not a war, not a pilgrimage, but the courage to remember, to look without blinking, to name things as they are, to say, never again, even when the banners are shinier. And the slogans rhyme. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us stay awake, the past won't have to scream, to be heard. It'll just whisper. And this time, we'll listen. But what happens when what we hear isn't a scream, or even a whisper, but a question? Not shouted from the rooftops, not carved into monuments, not wrapped in banners or blessed by saints. Just asked, quietly, inconveniently, what happens when the noise of war fades, and in its place, a barefoot man steps forward, not with a sword, but with the unbearable calm of someone who refuses to lie to himself? He won't save your soul. He won't conquer your enemies. He'll just ask, why do you believe what you believe? And that, somehow, might be the most dangerous thing of all. So tonight, we stay in the past. But trade the battlefield for a street corner in Athens. Trade armor for words. Trade certainty for doubt. And if you're still with me, still listening, then lean in. Because what comes next isn't a war. It's a conversation. And one that got a man killed. Picture a city so intoxicated with its own brilliance that even as the walls of its influence cracked and the shine of its golden age began to dim, it still strutted through history like a philosopher at a costume party, proud, dramatic, and just a little too convinced that it had all the answers. That city was Athens. Not the neat, mythologized version sold in tourist brochures or marble textbooks, but the real one, alive with contradiction, simmering with noise, and built on the fragile illusion that democracy and wisdom always go hand in hand. Athens, at its peak, wasn't just a city. It was a performance. Every decision, every debate, every dramatic gesture under the Acropolis was done with an audience in mind. Even if that audience was just the gods, who, quite frankly, were probably too exhausted to keep up. The assembly hall echoed not with reasoned argument, but with men shouting over each other like toddlers in togas, convinced that volume equaled virtue. And outside the halls of power, merchants, mystics, soldiers, poets, all weaving their own threads into a city that never quite slept and never stopped talking. It was a place that revered knowledge, as long as that knowledge didn't ask the wrong questions. You could talk about virtue, sure. You could discuss justice, of course. But start poking holes in the system? Start questioning the people in charge? Well, that was a different story, one that ended less with applause and more with a trial. Enter Socrates. Not a hero, not a prophet, just an old man with no shoes, a stubborn voice, and a knack for ruining everyone's day. He wasn't beautiful. He wasn't charming. He didn't write books or give lectures. What he did was infinitely worse. He asked questions. Not easy ones, either. Not the kind that made you feel smart and noble. He specialized in the ones that made your face twitch. The ones that exposed how much you didn't know, especially if you were important enough to pretend otherwise. To some, he was just annoying. To others, dangerous. He had no title, no army, no temple. Just a mind that wouldn't shut up and a city increasingly afraid of what it might say next. Because Athens, for all its glory, had developed a fragile ego. It had won wars, built monuments, birthed epics, and still, deep down, it knew that much of its power rested on myth. And nothing ruins a good myth like someone asking, but is that actually true? Socrates didn't shout. He didn't condemn. He didn't offer visions of doom or salvation. He simply stood there, calmly, and made people realize how little they actually understood about the very things they claimed to believe in: justice, honor, love, democracy. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to wake people up. And that, as it turns out, is the kind of thing that gets you killed. Because in a city addicted to certainty, the greatest crime is humility. He spent his days drifting through the marketplace, not buying, not selling, just orbiting, engaging, poking. He questioned poets who couldn't explain their own metaphors. He out-argued generals on courage. He dissected politicians like a man peeling fruit, calmly revealing the rot beneath the skin. And the thing that terrified them most? He did it all without anger, without force, just words. To the rich, he was insufferable. To the poor, he was confusing. To the youth, he was thrilling. The kind of teacher who didn't demand obedience, only curiosity. And that, perhaps, was his real offense. He made thinking look rebellious. Athens was proud of its freedom, as long as it looked and sounded exactly like what came before. It tolerated debate, but only in the familiar rhythm of tradition. Socrates broke that rhythm. He asked what happened when we stopped pretending, when we paused the performance, When we stood, naked and unprepared, in the face of actual truth. Not the polished, edited kind, but the ugly, contradictory mess of it. And so, in the city that claimed to love wisdom, the wisest man was eventually put on trial. Not for any crime you could easily point to, but for the sin of being a mirror, one too clear, too honest, too impossible to look away from. But we're not there yet. That part comes later. For now, he's still walking the dusty paths of Athens, barefoot and infuriating, asking strangers what they think justice is, and smiling gently when their answers begin to unravel. Somewhere, a merchant rolls his eyes. A priest mutters under his breath. A young man, wide-eyed, follows behind. The first of many who will watch this man rise not through power, but through discomfort. This is where it begins. Not in temples or wars or oracles, but in questions. And in a city about to learn, the hard way, that some answers echo far longer than it ever planned to listen. He wasn't beautiful. That much was obvious, even by Athenian standards, and let's be honest, they knew a thing or two about aesthetics. His face was famously odd. Wide eyes that bulged a little too much, a nose that had clearly lost a battle with symmetry, and a beard that looked like it was trying, and failing, to escape his chin. No divine glow, no aura of mystery, no perfect jawline to inspire sculpture. If anything, he looked like someone who had wandered in from the outskirts of town and stayed too long at the wine shop. And yet, people listened. Not because he spoke loudly, he didn't. Not because he commanded fear, he couldn't. But because once he asked you a question, you realized, too late, that your confidence had been a costume all along. Socrates didn't teach. Not in the traditional sense. He didn't stand on steps or deliver monologues to eager students scribbling notes. He wandered. He interrupted. He ambushed certainty like it owed him money. You might be discussing politics, or virtue, or what you plan to eat for lunch, and somehow, without warning, you'd be unraveling your own worldview in front of a small audience of confused bystanders and concerned relatives. His trick, if you could call it that, was disarming. He always began from a place of ignorance. "I don't know," he'd say, almost serenely, "but perhaps you do." And just like that, the trap was set. Because if you were foolish enough to claim certainty, to assert, for example, that you knew what justice was, or beauty, or courage, he'd start asking questions. Small ones at first. Harmless. Almost kind. Until, slowly, methodically, your answers began to fold in on themselves like bad origami. And the worst part? He wasn't trying to win. This wasn't a debate. It was an excavation. He dug through language, through assumptions, through the carefully curated identities people wore like togas, and when he was done, what remained wasn't defeat. It was exposure. You weren't humiliated. You were raw. And that, somehow, was worse. He never claimed to possess the truth. He claimed to be searching for it, but not in temples, not in scrolls, in people, ordinary people, slaves, merchants, priests, generals, artisans, politicians. No one was immune. He didn't discriminate based on status. If anything, he was more suspicious of the powerful. The more polished your rhetoric, the more dangerous your delusions, and the more fun he seemed to have unraveling them. Some accused him of being cruel, but there was no malice in his voice, only patience, and the maddening, quiet certainty of someone who had made peace with not knowing, which, in a city obsessed with knowledge, especially the kind that came with prizes and prestige, made him a walking heresy. You see, Athens didn't just value wisdom. It commodified it. Sophists, the sleek intellectual celebrities of the time, were paid handsomely to teach young elites how to argue persuasively. Not truthfully, persuasively. Words were weapons, and the goal wasn't enlightenment, it was victory. And then came Socrates, the anti-sophist. He didn't charge money. He didn't wear nice clothes. He didn't offer easy answers. He simply asked, and in doing so, made every other answer look suspiciously like a sales pitch. To the young, this was thrilling. He was rebellious without being reckless, subversive without needing a sword. He made them feel like their doubts weren't flaws. They were invitations. Invitations to think, to challenge, to disassemble the neat little truths they'd been handed by their fathers. To the establishment, however, he was a parasite. A man who contributed nothing to the economy, nothing to the military, nothing to the image of Athens as a beacon of order and reason, and yet somehow managed to plant doubt like weeds in the minds of the next generation. He wasn't dangerous because he knew too much. He was dangerous because he made everyone else realize how little they knew. And that, in the grand pageant of statecraft and public opinion, is unforgivable. So they began to whisper that he was corrupting the youth, that he disrespected the gods, that he was a threat to the fabric of the city. Because when you can't outthink a man, you don't debate him. You discredit him. But Socrates didn't flinch. He kept walking, kept talking, kept asking. Not because he was fearless, but because he genuinely believed the unexamined life wasn't worth living. And examining life, it turns out, is a full-time job with terrible benefits. Still, he pressed on. Not for fame, not for followers, but because somewhere, beneath the noise, he was convinced that truth, real truth, could be found. Not in proclamations, not in sermons, but in silence, in pauses, in the unraveling. And if that made him annoying, so be it. If that made him dangerous, so be it. Because, in a world built on performance, he was willing to be the heckler. Athens loved its gods, or, at least, it loved the idea of them. They were everywhere, etched into marble, sculpted onto rooftops, invoked before meals, battles, court sessions, and awkward family gatherings. The gods were omnipresent, yes, but more importantly, they were useful. Divine approval gave weight to law, blessed the currency, and justified whatever political theater happened to be unfolding that season. And into this pantheon of stone and ceremony came Socrates, unbothered, unimpressed, and utterly uninterested in pretending that praying harder made people wiser. He didn't desecrate temples or insult the deities outright. He simply asked why, if the gods were all-knowing and good, their followers spent so much time being petty and confused. It was, of course, a rhetorical question. But Athens didn't appreciate rhetorical questions when they exposed theological loopholes. Especially not from a man who didn't even offer incense. The irony, of course, is that Socrates wasn't an atheist. Far from it. He spoke often, and sincerely, about a divine voice, a guiding spirit that nudged him away from error. But his God wasn't sculpted in bronze or flattered with sacrifices. His God whispered, interrupted, questioned. It sounded suspiciously like a conscience. And that, apparently, was sacrilege. Because in Athens, it wasn't enough to revere the divine. You had to do it publicly, performatively, and preferably while reinforcing the status quo. And Socrates? He was terrible at that. Worse still, he didn't limit his inquiries to temples. He began asking questions about laws, about justice, about truth, not the poetic kind that came pre-packaged in civic slogans, but the kind that made jurors sweat and priests reconsider their pension plans. He wanted to know why the court system rewarded eloquence over evidence, why orators could twist morality into knots and still walk away applauded, why those who committed atrocities in war returned as heroes, while those who questioned the war were branded traitors. To be clear, he wasn't trying to overthrow the system. He wasn't waving banners or gathering troops. His revolution had no marching orders. It began and ended in thought. But thought, when wielded without fear, has a tendency to make empires twitch. And Athens, for all its supposed tolerance, was increasingly twitchy. This was, after all, a city recovering from trauma. Not long before, it had endured tyranny, real tyranny, not the metaphorical kind that professors write books about. The 30 tyrants had ruled with iron fists and sharp blades, and when democracy returned, it did so with a nervous smile and a desperate need to prove itself both moral and strong. Which meant Athens needed enemies. External ones, ideally, but internal ones would do in a pinch. And Socrates? He wasn't just internal. He was embedded. He knew the city too well. He knew its leaders, its history, its hypocrisies. And worse, he wasn't afraid to say them out loud. In public, to anyone. He was that person at the dinner party who doesn't just ruin the vibe. He rearranges the furniture. And so, the narrative began to shift. He wasn't a thinker anymore. He was a threat. Not because of what he did, but because of what he refused to do. Conform, flatter, shut up. The charges, when they came, were dressed in moral language. Corrupting the youth. Disrespecting the gods. Undermining the values of the city. But everyone knew, even those pretending not to, that the real crime was intellectual insubordination. He refused to play the part assigned to him. He refused to pretend that democracy was functioning just because it was shouting. And so, the court, that proud pillar of Athenian identity, became the stage for what can only be described as the most passive-aggressive political assassination in history. Because Athens didn't want blood. It wanted quiet. It didn't want vengeance. It wanted erasure. A soft execution. Philosophical euthanasia. And Socrates, for his part, didn't resist. Not because he agreed, but because he believed that refusing to play the game was, in itself, the only move worth making. It didn't begin with fire or violence. No mob with torches. No tyrant in a chariot shouting orders to silence the wise. No, Athens was far more civilized than that. It preferred its executions with paperwork, its silencing done not with blades, but with ballots. They called it justice. They called it a trial. And on the surface, that's exactly what it looked like. Socrates, the old man with no shoes and too many questions, was brought before 500 of his fellow citizens. Ordinary men, selected by lottery, most of whom had probably grown tired of hearing his name, if not his actual voice. It was meant to be democratic. Fair. A reflection of Athenian values. But of course, when a city feels threatened by its own reflection, even fairness becomes a costume. The charges were familiar, if vague. Corrupting the youth, failing to acknowledge the state gods, introducing new deities. That last one was especially ironic, considering Athens had more gods than drinking cups. But no matter. The real crime was unspoken. Everyone in the room knew it. Socrates had made powerful men feel small, not with force, but with questions. And in a society where ego was currency, that was unforgivable. His accusers were not monsters. They were functionaries, intellectual bureaucrats armed with prepared speeches and carefully rehearsed outrage. They talked of morals, of duty, of the danger of philosophy when taken too far, as though thinking critically was a gateway drug to revolution. And then Socrates stood to speak. No tears, no pleading, no dramatic proclamations of innocence. He opened his mouth and ruined their script. Because instead of defending himself, he clarified what he stood for. Not just what he did, but why. He explained that he had never claimed to be a teacher or to possess wisdom, only to search for it. That his so-called corruption, was nothing more than encouraging young people to think, to challenge lazy logic, to refuse certainty without understanding. He didn't apologize. He didn't flatter. He didn't beg. He stood in front of 500 men and calmly explained that they were about to kill someone who had spent his life trying to make them better. And then, perhaps worst of all, he offered an alternative sentence. Not exile, not silence, but, in perfect Socratic irony, free meals for life as a reward for his service to the city. It was a joke, yes, but also a dare. And the court didn't laugh, because Athens, like most fragile institutions, had no sense of humor when it came to being exposed. The vote was close, closer than history tends to admit, but the majority tipped toward guilt. The philosopher was sentenced to death, not by sword or hanging, but by hemlock. A tidy poison, a quiet death, exactly the kind Athens preferred. And yet, in that moment, something cracked. Not in Socrates, but in the idea that the city could control its own myth. Because by killing him, they made him immortal. By silencing him, they amplified his voice. And by condemning his questions, they ensured that those questions would echo for centuries. It wasn't a trial. It was a confession from a city that had grown afraid of its own ideals. And the man they feared most? He drank the poison without trembling. Not because he welcomed death, but because, to him, the real betrayal wasn't dying. It was living without truth. There was no escape plan. No hidden tunnel beneath the prison. No last-minute pardon delivered by a tearful messenger on horseback. Athens wasn't that kind of story. And Socrates, stubborn, absurd, maddening Socrates, wasn't that kind of man. His friends, of course, tried. They pleaded. They begged. Some even arranged a way out. There were whispers of bribed guards, secret boats, sanctuary across the sea. All he had to do was say yes. All he had to do was admit that the city was wrong. That he was right. That this was injustice, plain and simple. And he refused. Not because he trusted the system. That illusion had already been shattered. But because, in some twisted, beautiful logic only he could fully believe in, escaping would have been a betrayal. Not of Athens, but of himself. Of everything he claimed to stand for. Because if philosophy meant anything, if virtue mattered at all, then it had to matter when it was inconvenient. Otherwise, it was just decoration, an intellectual trinket. And so, he stayed. The prison cell was quiet. No chanting mobs. No ceremonial procession. Just stone walls, anxious disciples, and the slow, dreadful awareness that this would be the last conversation they'd ever have with the man who had taught them how to question everything, including death. He wasn't afraid. That was the worst part. He joked. He comforted. He reminded them that the soul, whatever it was, wasn't something that poison could reach. And then came the cup. Hemlock, a cold, almost clinical end. Not dramatic. Not violent. Just a numbness that starts at the feet and climbs, slowly, deliberately, until the lungs forget what to do. It was, in a way, a philosopher's death. Logical, quiet, painfully precise. He took it without flinching. Not out of bravado, but because he had already rehearsed this in his mind 1,000 times. He spoke until he couldn't, smiled until he shouldn't have been able to, and then lay down, calmly, as if drifting off in thought. One last argument unfinished in his head. Those who watched didn't cry at first. They froze. Because how do you mourn someone who just turned death into a seminar? But then came the silence. The unbearable, infuriating silence. And that's when it sank in. He was gone. Not in theory. Not as a metaphor. But really, irreversibly gone. No more questions. No more pauses. No more maddening follow-ups. Athens had gotten what it wanted. Quiet. But the price was a man who had held up a mirror so perfectly that even the gods might have winced. And as the cup was taken away, as the disciples wept, as the city outside returned to its normal noise and commerce and rhetoric, something shifted. Not loudly, not immediately, but undeniably. Because that death, so calm, so defiant, wasn't an ending. It was a challenge. One that would haunt empires, professors, revolutionaries, and students for millennia. Not what would Socrates do, but something far more dangerous. What if he was right? The day after, the city did what cities do best. It pretended. Markets reopened. Children played. Politicians returned to the usual rituals of pretending to care. The sun rose over the Acropolis just as it always had, indifferent, brilliant, and blinding. Nothing exploded. No divine retribution. No thunderous signs from Olympus. Just life, continuing, stubbornly, as if nothing had happened. And maybe, to most, nothing had. After all, Socrates had been just one man. No army, no wealth, no office. He hadn't written a single book. His teachings existed only in the minds of those who had sat near him, annoyed by him, been dismantled and rebuilt by his words. And now he was gone. That should have been the end. But something felt off. A quiet hung in the air, one that didn't belong to grief, but to doubt. It was the kind of silence that doesn't settle. It seeps. The kind that lingers behind every conversation, every vote, every temple offering. A whisper that something important had been removed, and with it, something irretrievable. At first, people tried to explain it away. He had been troublesome, yes, but perhaps necessary. Difficult, but honest. A crank, maybe, but a crank that kept the machinery of thought turning. And now that he was gone, the gears were still spinning, but off-kilter. Like a song missing its bass line. A question with no one left to raise their hand. His students, shattered and restless, didn't vanish. They gathered. They remembered. Some wrote, reluctantly. Some wandered, in search of other cities willing to tolerate doubt. And one, in particular, Plato, took it personally. Plato, the student with too much discipline and just enough poetry in his bones, began to turn memory into myth. Not myth in the sense of fantasy, but in the sense of permanence. He crafted dialogues, resurrecting his teacher with every line. He gave Socrates back his voice, sharpened, idealized, eternal. If Athens wouldn't preserve him, Plato would. Page by page, word by word. And so, ironically, the man who never wrote a sentence became one of the most cited thinkers in history. The city, meanwhile, tried to move on. It praised its democracy. It celebrated its festivals. It recited the same values that Socrates had once dissected on street corners. But underneath the civic pride, a crack had formed, small, but growing. Because it's hard to glorify reason in the same breath that you recall killing its most loyal servant. There were murmurs, regret, quiet admissions, always in private, that perhaps, it had been a mistake. That the trial hadn't been justice, but fear in a toga. But admitting that publicly, that would require the very kind of honesty Socrates had died for. And Athens, it turned out, wasn't ready for that level of irony. So instead, the city buried him twice. First with poison, then with silence. But silence has a peculiar quality. It doesn't erase. It echoes. And slowly, like rain seeping through marble, Socrates returned. Not in flesh, but in questions. In doubt. In the quiet discomfort that now lived in every courtroom, every academy, every place where people dared to claim certainty. He became not just a man, but a mirror. And though the city tried to forget, history didn't. Because once a question has been asked, truly asked, it never dies. It waits, it watches, and eventually, it is asked again. History likes to pretend it moves on its own, that ideas simply rise like the sun, independent of the hands that lift them. But the truth is, every great idea has a curator, a translator, someone obsessive enough, wounded enough, to pick up the broken pieces of what was lost and start stitching them into something permanent. For Socrates, that someone was Plato. Plato didn't just admire his teacher. He revered him, in that quiet, dangerous way that only the young can revere the old, where every word becomes gospel, every silence a parable. And when Athens silenced Socrates, Plato didn't just grieve. He got to work. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't march or rage. Instead, he did something far more subversive. He wrote dialogue after dialogue, with Socrates not as a background figure, but as the lead, still questioning, still annoying, still impossible to pin down. And in doing so, Plato didn't just preserve his mentor's voice. He elevated it. The Socrates we know today, that relentless, witty, unflinching interrogator of truth, that's Plato's Socrates. Not necessarily the one who walked barefoot through Athens, but the one who refused to die. A construct, yes, but also a tribute, a resurrection, a weapon against forgetting. Plato was no mere stenographer. He sculpted, he edited, he sharpened. His Socrates is more eloquent, more dramatic, more pointed than any real man could be. But that was the point. Where Athens had tried to kill a man, Plato raised a myth. One that could not be poisoned, or silenced, or buried under marble. And what did he do with that myth? He built a world with it. Through Socrates, Plato questioned not just politics and ethics, but reality itself. What is justice? What is love? What is knowledge? And, most dangerously of all, how do we know anything at all? He wasn't just preserving a teacher's voice. He was laying the foundation for an entirely new way of thinking. One that valued reason over ritual, clarity over charisma, and most terrifyingly, doubt over comfort. He created the academy, not just a school, but a sanctuary for dangerous questions. For minds that refused to bow to tradition, to dogma, to convenient lies. It was, in many ways, the first organized rebellion of thought. A place where Socrates lived on, not in body, but in structure, in method, in every raised eyebrow and counter-question. And while the city outside pretended to be stable, eternal, glorious, Plato's academy whispered something far more lasting, that truth doesn't need monuments. It just needs memory, and people brave enough to carry it forward. Of course, Plato wasn't perfect. He had his own agendas, his own blind spots. He couldn't help but idealize, to polish Socrates until he gleamed with philosophical perfection. But can you blame him? When the world kills your hero, your only revenge is to make him unforgettable. And it worked. Because through Plato, Socrates became a kind of intellectual virus, spreading through minds, across continents, across centuries. Every philosopher who came after, Aristotle, Descartes, Nietzsche, all of them had to wrestle with the ghost Plato had summoned. Athens may have buried a man, but Plato unearthed a movement. Change didn't come with banners or blades. It came in sentences, carefully written, quietly mourned, sharp enough to wound. And so, the man who died quietly lived louder than any general or king. Because Plato didn't just ask the world to remember. He made it impossible to forget. Ideas, when dangerous enough, don't die. They mutate. They travel. not in armies or scrolls, but in whispers, in metaphors, in the uneasy questions that slip through generations like smoke under a locked door. Socrates never left a manifesto. No 10 commandments of logic. No neat list of how to annoy powerful people in 10 easy steps. What he left, or rather, what Plato preserved, was something far more enduring, the habit of doubt. The compulsion to ask, to prod, to refuse the comfort of certainty. And from the moment it took root, it began to spread. At first, it was slow. Philosophy wasn't trending. Kings didn't fund it. The average citizen preferred oracles to syllogisms. But the spark had been lit. Quietly, dangerously, in places of study and silence, the ghost of Socrates began to reappear, in monastic cells, where monks wrestled with ethics in candlelight, in medieval universities, where students were warned not to think too hard and then did anyway, in courtrooms, where justice began to look suspiciously like performance art with better costumes. He became the uninvited guest in every debate, the voice at the back of the room asking, "But how do you know?" Not out of rebellion, not out of pride, but because once you've seen through a lie dressed as tradition, you can't unsee it. This wasn't a revolution of blood. It was slower, stranger. It crept through language, through education, through the way people began to listen, not to authority, but to contradiction. Even religion, the most jealous of certainties, felt it. Priests and scholars began to argue not just over doctrine, but over why they believed what they believed. Not whether God existed, but whether faith required ignorance to survive. Some embraced the tension. Others burned people for it. Because doubt, as it turns out, is contagious. And not everyone appreciates an outbreak. And still, Socrates remained. Not in statues or state holidays, but in the very structure of thought. You could see him in the way questions were framed, in the way students were taught to argue, in the way a single why could derail a sermon, a lecture, a law. He was the flaw in the machine, the one screw left deliberately loose. And just when history thought it had assimilated him, tamed him, filed him neatly under ancient thinker, the Enlightenment happened. Suddenly, the world remembered that it was allowed to think, to question kings, to dissect scripture, to debate reality. Descartes declared, "I think, therefore I am," and in the silence that followed, you could almost hear Socrates mutter, "Okay, but what do you mean by think?" The inheritance of doubt had arrived. Not as chaos, but as clarity. Not to destroy, but to refine. To burn away the certainty that had calcified into dogma. And with every generation, new thinkers picked up the thread. Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, Simone Weil, Hannah Arendt. Each arguing, each doubting, each adding their own stubborn question to the pile. Not because they wanted answers, but because they understood, as Socrates once had, that the moment you stop asking, you start obeying. And nothing, not empire, not church, not nation, should be obeyed without question. So the inheritance continued, carried not in bloodlines, but in books, in classrooms, in late-night conversations between exhausted friends, who realize, terrifyingly, that none of them knows what truth really is. And in that moment, Socrates lives again. In a world addicted to answers, clean, fast, preferably under 280 characters, the man who claimed to know nothing feels almost offensive. Like a glitch in the system. An error message blinking does not compute in a culture that sells certainty like bottled water. We pride ourselves on how quickly we can form opinions, how decisively we can shout into the void. But rarely, so rarely, do we pause long enough to wonder, what if I'm wrong? That question, once whispered by a barefoot philosopher on the dusty streets of Athens, is now drowned out by algorithmic hysteria. The louder you speak, the more attention you get. The more outrage you generate, the more currency you earn. Socrates, with his quiet and maddening refusal to pretend he had the answers, would be the least profitable influencer on the planet. He wouldn't play the game. He wouldn't sell you a lifestyle. He'd sit you down and ask why you needed one in the first place. And you'd hate him for it. Because we don't want introspection. We want affirmation. Not truth, just a team. To be told we're right, that our enemies are wrong, that our tribe is special. Socrates would cut through that like a scalpel. Not to hurt, but to expose. Not to win, but to ask the kind of questions that don't get answers. Only silence. He wouldn't give a TED talk. He'd give you a headache. And you'd need it. Because we're drowning in data and starving for wisdom. We scroll past nuance like it's spam. We confuse speed with clarity, performance with understanding, noise with knowledge. Socrates didn't care about performance. He cared about what was left when it ended. What you believed when no one was clapping. What you feared when no one was watching. He didn't shame ignorance. He honored it as the only honest place to begin. And maybe that's why we resist him now. Because if we start with "I don't know," all the things we built to look wise, headlines, platforms, certainty, start to fall apart. So we keep pretending. Keep arguing like volume is virtue. Keep mistaking followers for credibility. And the world? It just gets louder, angrier, dumber. But Socrates is still there. In the margins. In the silence between updates. He's not gone. Just waiting. Waiting for us to remember that freedom doesn't come from being right. It comes from being willing to be wrong. Because that's the real revolution. Not the one with marches and speeches. But the quiet, terrifying moment when someone says, "I don't know, but I want to." And that's why we still need the man who knew nothing. Because in a world performing certainty, his silence might be the only honest sound left. He left no books, no creed, no empire, just questions. And questions, real ones, don't die. They echo through centuries, through kings, gods, borders, ideologies, whispering behind every declaration. What do you mean by that? How do you know? Who told you, and why did you believe them? You can ban books, erase names, kill the man, but not the habit of doubt. It spreads like ivy, quietly, relentlessly, until even marble starts to crack. You'll find it everywhere, in classrooms, in courtrooms, at dinner tables, in the sudden, unnerving moment when you pause and think, wait, that doesn't make sense. It needs no temple, no hashtag, just one mind, brave enough to be unsure. That's the immortality he earned. Not because he sought it, but because forgetting him would require forgetting how to think. And if he showed up today, in a world of gurus, influencers, and algorithm-approved wisdom, he'd do what he always did. He wouldn't preach. He'd interrupt. He'd tilt his head and ask the tech bro why money sounds like truth. He'd lean in toward the protester and the politician. Not to argue, but to wonder aloud if they actually understand the slogans they chant. He'd turn to you and ask why, after all this time, you're still listening. And when you froze, unsure, exposed, he'd smile, not smugly, but with that maddening, quiet joy of someone who never needed to win, just to awaken. And now that you've heard him, even for a second, you're not the same, not better, just less certain, more alive. So when the world shouts again, and it will, when the slogans rise, the headlines howl, the noise demands your allegiance. Listen harder. You might hear it. That whisper. The one voice. Still asking. Why you believe. Everything. And maybe, this time, you'll answer him. Not with a speech, but with a pause.